مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. رئيس جديد أي سياسة خارجية جديدة، إلا أنه مع الرئيس ترامب جوانب كثيرة من اتجاه أمريكا الجديد في الشؤون الدولية تبقى غير واضحة المعلم. هل ستقف أمريكا في وش التهديدات المتنامية من كوريا الشمالية والصين وروسيا، أم أنها ستنسحب من مواجهة هذه التحديات؟ التنبؤ كما قال الرسول دين الحمقى، ولكن التحليل الحكيم يساعدنا في الإعداد المستقبل. ولتقديم تحليل حكيم حول اتجاه الأحداث الدولية والسياسة الولايات المتحدة تحت إدارة ترامب، يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا التي تضم الخبيرين وان زراتي ودينيس روس. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. 2016 was an eventful, difficult, complex year for world politics and American foreign policy. Let's take a look at this year in review and draw some conclusions, perhaps, for the year ahead. Delighted to have our panelists with us today. Gentlemen, let's begin with what I'll call the Empire Strikes Back. Russia, reassertion, resurgence in the Middle East and elsewhere. What happened, and what are the implications of this reassertion of Russian influence? Dennis, want to start us off?
Well, I think what happened more than anything else was Vladimir Putin has always been motivated by the desire to reestablish Russia on the world stage. Among many in Russia, but particularly in his case, the loss of a superpower status was a trauma, literally a national trauma. And he saw the weakness of the 1990s as almost leading to a collapse of the country. And I think he sees weakness and chaos emerging from that. And for him, the restoration of power was and is a prime objective. It's a mission. Now, what he also has come to understand, it's good politics. You know, it wasn't just a trauma for him, it was a national trauma, and the psychology of it is, in a sense, infected all of the body politic. So this restoration of power is almost like a psychological reassurance. And so it's been very good politics for him. And, you know, he also had a kind of interesting set of circumstances that permitted him to reassert Russia on the world stage, because he had, in the Obama administration and in President Obama, someone who frequently saw the exercise of power as a 20th century approach, not a 21st century approach. It contributed to vacuums that allowed Vladimir Putin to fill and to, in a sense, assert Russia in a way that transformed and translated very effectively on the inside of Russia and outside. So he seized Crimea, he has played a game in Ukraine. In every case where you've seen him move, even in Syria where he did it under the cover of darkness and with a surprise, he doesn't do it in a way that is designed to run great risks. You know, when he uses hybrid warfare, when he uses little green men, he creates deniability. When he does things under the cover of darkness and has a surprise, he creates fait accompli. So, in a sense, he's not testing others in an overt way that produces an immediate response. He tests in a way that allows him to determine whether he's going to get a response, and when he sees he's not going to get a response, then he acts more forcefully.
So, Juan, he may do it under darkness and do it stealthily, but there is no doubt that today Vladimir Putin is a more powerful and influential man at the end of 2016 than at any point of his presidency. What are the implications of this, do you see?
Well, I think in 2016, all roads have led to Moscow. And I think Dennis is absolutely right that Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin have seized power vacuums. And frankly, the willingness of the U.S. to rely on Russia almost at every turn for potential diplomatic openings or to resolve issues. Syria chief among them, but even in the context of the Ukraine and in the context of the Iranian deal, the Russians have become central to how the United States has thought about resolution of these issues, and that has emboldened him. I think we need to look back to the Red Line episode, where it was actually the Russians that gave President Obama the lifeline, where I think that was really the testing moment in the Syrian context for President Putin. He understood that President Obama really didn't want to act. He saw that the Russians could serve as the diplomatic saviors of the moment, to which the U.S. would be in some ways beholden, and they could do so in a way that would reinforce their interests and support President Assad in Syria and reinforce his legitimacy. A brilliant maneuver in some ways, opportunistic, and that then I think began to animate further all of the ambitions and policies that Dennis has laid out so well in the Ukraine, in Syria, and beyond. One final point, they've clearly wanted to send messages. So I agree with Dennis, they've been very artful in the use of information warfare, cyber tactics, little green men, special forces, unmarked vehicles and the rest to exert power. But they've also exerted power in ways to really demonstrate that they are pushing back, strafing U.S. naval vessels on the high seas, pushing back against NATO forces, sending their submarines near European countries' coastlines, and even visiting places like Cuba and signing deals with Nicaragua to really send a signal that we are trying to push back on the
Russia
are trying to push back on an American-centric world, and frankly are trying to push new norms and narratives, that redefine what is legitimate. And that's something that I think Vladimir Putin has done masterfully in 2016.
So a good year for Putin in 2016.
Yeah, it's ironic. It was a very good year for him in one respect. It was a bad year domestically, not for him politically, but economically. The purchasing power of Russian citizens has fallen dramatically. So from that standpoint, he's taken a weak hand and he's actually played it remarkably well. And that's why I say it's been good politics for him, because it also deflects attention away from what is otherwise a source of real unhappiness domestically.
So if there had to be one image that I'm left with in 2016, it's either this tragic image of this child washing up on a European shore, a refugee child dead, or the young boy shell-shocked in Syria. So let's talk about this human legacy of 2016, the refugee crisis. What are the strategic implications of the refugee crisis?
Well, those are devastating images, and I think anyone who has a heart, or frankly those of us who have children, probably wept when we saw those images, and really does reinforce the fact that we're talking about human beings and real lives that are being affected by these conflicts. But strategically, I think that the reality is that the flow of refugees and the displacement of certainly the conflict in Syria, but even the displacement in places like Libya and some of the conflicts in Africa, where you're seeing a lot of the refugees flow from, and places like Afghanistan, is causing huge tension, obviously, in the European context. Questions around even the viability of the European Union, whether or not the European Union can resolve refugee issues, and whether or not there can be a common policy, while there's other questions about the viability of the European Union. So that has immediate impact. You have immediate impact around the neighborhood of these countries that are in such chaos and conflict. Countries like Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan that are under the pressure of these massive refugee populations. That begins to change the politics and has begun to change the politics of the region. The refugees as well have been used as tools. We've seen this in the context of President Assad really sort of being open to having the floodgates open to refugees as a matter of pressure on Turkey and his neighbors and Europe. And we've seen Erdogan use the refugees as a bargaining chip with Europe in a fairly crass foreign policy move to use the threat He's literally used the threat of opening the gates of the refugees into Europe as a way of building leverage with the European Union. So it's horrific what's happening individually, but strategically relevant that you have this mass dislocation. And frankly, it doesn't end in 2016. The sad reality is these conflicts continue to churn dislocation internally and externally that will be with us well into 2017 and beyond.
Yep. Okay, we're going to have to come back in just a minute to continue this, because 2016 was a huge year. We'll come back in just a minute to talk more about all these issues with our guests. And Dennis, I'm going to pick up on that last word, peace. 2016 was not a good year for peace. Ceasefires fell apart in Syria. Arab-Israeli peace went nowhere. And even in a place like Colombia, the Nobel Peace Prize winner won an award for a peace agreement that fell apart days after his award. What is going on? Why so little peace in the world today?
Well, again, I think part of it is that you're dealing with what may be also leaderships that are not that strong. Leaderships that themselves are frequently alienated from their publics, which makes it difficult to make big decisions, certainly makes it difficult to pursue peace agreements. What happened in Colombia, I mean, the good news is it appears that there is now a new agreement that may well be ratified. But I think that's more the exception than the norm. In Syria, I think it's different because it's not a question of weak leaders. In Syria, it's a case that the leverage to produce a political outcome hasn't been exercised. The Russians haven't been interested until now, although I think that soon will become the case. But in 2016, the Russians were more interested in changing the balance of power on the ground within Syria, preserving Assad in power as a symbol of their success and the implications of being a friend of Russia, and wanting, in a sense, to use it as a vehicle to lever greater weight within the region as a whole, to send a message to the other countries in the region: if you want to pursue your interests in this region, you need to have good relations with Moscow. So, in a sense, the approach to Syria was quite instrumental, and we, the United States, exercised no leverage. If you had wanted a political outcome in Syria, you had to be prepared to use some military means. Every time the Obama administration said there's no military solution to Syria, it was an irrelevant statement. No one says there's a military solution to Syria, but clearly Vladimir Putin thinks there are military means you can use to produce a political outcome in Syria, and we took ourselves out of the game. So if you want to exercise diplomacy that's effective to produce peace, there always needs to be a lever there. There needs to be a coercive element there, and there really wasn't on the part of the United States. I think as a general rule, if you're thinking about the absence of peace, think also about where is the leverage and who has it.
Now, Juan, you referred earlier, I think very powerfully, to the impact of migration and the refugee flows. Clearly, one of the most important implications had to do with its impact on the British vote to leave the European Union, a historic shift after decades of consolidation. What does this portend?
Well, it's a wonderful question, because I think it's not just a question of what's happened in the United Kingdom or even in the European context, but it's also a question of how we view immigration writ large. I would argue it also impacted the U.S. election, where President Trump used the thematic of immigration, largely concerns about immigration from the South, but also immigration from the Middle East, as a key talking point, a key image. Even his closing ad right before the election, there was a key element to the concern about swarms of migrants heading into the United States. So this concern about this dislocation that's happening around the world, the flow of refugees and displaced people, and this concern about the change of identity and culture is really something that's happening. Dennis was talking earlier about what Vladimir Putin has done in the context of the latching on to nationalism and pride. And I think what you're starting to see is a reorientation of nationalism and identity in the face of this dislocation, cultural, migratory, and otherwise. And I think part of the Brexit vote, maybe not all of it, but part of it had to do with national identity. Britain being Britain, not being governed by bureaucrats in Brussels, but instead defining their own identity, their own path and course by themselves. So, to make America great again, it's a core theme in that thread.
So have we seen the beginning of the end of the European Union?
Maybe. Well, look, if in fact if the right wins in France, then you begin to see, especially for France, which has been kind of the linchpin of the EU, then I think it raises basic questions about the long-term viability of the EU as a whole. It is conceivable you could have a rump EU. I'm not predicting right now that we're going to see the end of the EU because it still serves real purposes, but there is something deeper going on that Juan puts his finger on. We are seeing a reaction to globalization. We're seeing a reaction to what is the sense to reduce the importance of national identities and the importance of sovereignty, creating more federal kinds of governmental approaches, in a sense has maybe reached a point where the backlash against it is a potent political force. We've seen it not just in Brexit, now we've seen it here. Maybe we will see it in the elections in France as well. It is a lesson for everybody that the idea that you can somehow begin to erode or dilute the national identity without a political consequence, I think is something that is really an illusion.
All right, gentlemen, so far this has been a pretty depressing discussion of what happened in 2016. Peace agreements falling apart, refugee flows, etc. What was the most hopeful news story, upbeat, positive event in 2016? And we can't talk about the Chicago Cubs.
Too bad.
Well, I would say look at South America because you did have the march toward peace in Colombia with a little bit of a hiccup in terms of the vote in Colombia, but it seems like all parties want war to end there. You still have elements of terrorist groups like ELN and others that haven't signed the peace deal, but there's movement toward peace as well as progress there. In addition, you've had political shifts in places like Argentina, which have moved back to the center and clearly want to be a part of the international community. You have countries like Chile, like Peru, Uruguay, even though you've got crisis in Brazil. South America is a continent that should be filled with some hope and prospect. We often ignore it unless there's a crisis, as we see in Venezuela or Brazil. But for the most part, the trends are actually pretty good. And I think we need to tend to that a bit more, and we need to pay attention to it, because if our gaze is constantly pulled by conflict around the world, especially in the Middle East, we lose opportunities to solidify progress.
All right, good news in Latin America. Dennis, some good news?
Well, I'm going to surprise you perhaps. I think in the Middle East there's been some good news. And these represent, I think, real possibilities. One, there clearly is a convergence of interest between the Sunni-led states and Israel, which I think promises something useful both vis-a-vis Iran, but even potentially on the peace issue between Israelis and Palestinians. Secondly, I would say what's taking place in Saudi Arabia. We've never had a successful model of development in the Arab world, and Saudi Arabia may be the country that is going to produce it.
Okay, good news even in the Middle East. All right, so far I've asked you about scenarios. We have less than a minute left. Where's some place around the world that probably isn't on the list of worry spots for General Flynn, the incoming National Security Advisor, but ought to be?
Yeah.
Juan?
I think Afghanistan and Pakistan continues to be a region of concern for a couple of reasons. Stability in Kabul is not certain. It's not a given. It's where we continue to have troops. President Obama will leave office with U.S. troops still on the ground, NATO troops there, with the rise, it appears, again, of elements of al-Qaeda, dangerously, and the issue and questions of stability in Pakistan still at play, with ISIS attacks continuing as we speak in Pakistan. In addition, you have the mix of tension with Pakistan and India, which all plays into a South Asian cauldron of conflict, potentially, that we've got to watch very carefully. So I would watch South Asia in addition to North Korea and these other things that we've talked about.
South Asia. Dennis?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I do think North Korea is the other potential flashpoint. You have a leader who is completely unpredictable. And the one thing about, I think, a President Trump, it's his unpredictability that may give others caution. You know, someone like, you have a North Korean leader who likes to have attention on himself. And he could do something designed to draw attention to himself. If President-elect Trump is someone who feels that he's being challenged, he is the kind who will always feel like he has to respond to it. So I would say, in addition to South Asia, I would say North Korea is a place to watch.
Okay. Gentlemen, I hope the good news outweighs the bad news in 2017. Thank you so much for joining us today. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول مستقبل العلاقات بين الولايات المتحدة وروسيا، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.